Hold on. I'll do introduction and stuff after I share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Hello. My name is Ahmad. I am a senior at the University of Chicago, and today I'm giving a quick lecture on how to give PMRs and how to strategically think about PMRs when you are going into those speeches. So the PMR is probably the strongest speech on APDA, or at least has the highest capacity to change your ability to win or lose rounds. Really quickly, I'm going to explain why a PMR can be very devastating or very strong in any given round. And then I'm going to talk about some strategies that you can implement into your debates on how you can make your PMRs both better rhetorically for things like speaks and also better strategically for things like just winning rounds outright. So if we were to take an average round, for example, you have lots of PM arguments, lots of LO arguments, and lots of things that are just floating around. In these types of rounds, you may assume that the PMR is a quite difficult speech because you have to pick and choose or try and beat everything. But more often than not, what ends up happening is the PMR is able to pick the specific things that it thinks are the most important or the specific things that it thinks are most strategic. So what often ends up happening is because you give a speech that sees the rest of the round as it has occurred, you can step in the PMR and act as the judge or create ballots that you would want the judge to pick up on and then regurgitate in their RFD. How do we do this? So first, I'm going to go through what constitutes a ballot or how you actually create a ballot in the PMR. I'm going to talk about some common things I see in PMR that are actually quite bad ballots or quite unstrategic. So first on what a ballot is and is not. When you think about creating ballots, they are essentially separate and individual reasons to vote for your side of the house, right? So on Gov, you may have 3 ballots and they may be 3 distinct reasons to vote with distinct weighing. Importantly, if you have multiple arguments that get at the same impact or come to the same reason to vote, these can be collapsed into one larger ballot. And when you are creating those ballots, they should often be distinct and separate from one another. So a couple of things you want to think about when you are creating them. First is the rhetoric, right? Your story or the way in which Gov tries to win a round is often created way before you step into a round. So when a case is created, you often have an idea in mind or certain things that you think are important or good or bad that you want to change. And you want to make sure that that rhetoric is clear in the ballot story that you're creating, because often a very persuasive ballot becomes the ballot that the judge looks to or thinks about first when the round ends. So it's often a strategic advantage for your ballot not only to be like argumentatively sound, but also persuasively sound and consistent with the rest of the speeches in the Gov in the Gov side of the House. Because otherwise you may confuse judges and lead them to think that your ballots are less important. The second part of this is a condensing of argumentation. So likely at this point in the debate, you have had a large number of arguments. Some of them may overlap, but some of them may be completely different. But importantly, when they are being brought into a ballot, you can pull warrants or reasons for why this ballot may be true from essentially the entire debate. There may be parts from PMC, there may be parts from MG, there may be parts that are just brand new that are response material to MO. You should take these arguments and condense them into something that is both concise and understandable because your PMR is only 5 minutes. Second, you should look to the responses, not just to these individual arguments, but to the more broad ballot or story that you're trying to push when you're creating a ballot. Because, and something that I see very often is people will read ballots that maybe they just started writing after PMC ended, or maybe they started writing them halfway through MG, and just ignore a lot of the common responses that op has read to these ballots or to these arguments, and then just hope the judge also ignores them. But more often than not, the judge will see them and see them as reasons to discredit not just the argument, but the entire ballot or more broad story that you're trying to push in PMR. So you should make sure that you are reconciling your ballot with those responses, either by answering them directly when you are giving the ballot, or by weighing against them and explaining why, even if those responses are true, they still allow you to access some of your impact or access some of the narrative that you're going for in this ballot. The next thing is impacting and weighing. So this is something that you may be more familiar with, like this is bad because it hurts a wide number of people, or this is bad because it hurts people very severely. You should still be doing this, and the weighing and impacting you're doing should be connected to the actual arguments that you're making in the ballot. So don't overclaim the impacts that you want relative to the reasons you've read, and also don't underclaim them. But you should make sure, to the best of your ability, that they are more important comparatively to the things that the op is going to say in their MO and LOR. The last thing is maybe something that doesn't get done very often, but actually ends up being quite important to any ballot being persuasive. And that is, you have to contextualize the ballot that the PMR is going for against or within the rest of the round. So something that you may have often heard is like, okay, op wins this, gov wins this. I don't know how to weigh them against each other, and I'm never told how they weigh against each other, so I'm just going to intervene and pick the one I think is more important. If you do explicit contextualization of your ballots, you can stop this from ever happening in your rounds. So for example, you could say, my ballot is more important than this ballot from the LOR for these 3 reasons. Maybe it happens faster, maybe it is more probable, maybe it is a prior question to anything that the op may bring, or change the way in which the op functions. You need to be explicit in, when you are reading a ballot, contextualizing how the judge is supposed to interpret that ballot against the rest of the round. This is also because sometimes ballots do different things. Some ballots should be reasons why I'm voting for the gov. Other ballots can be reasons why I would never vote for the op. Whatever your ballot is trying to do, you should explain to the judge why it is there and why you justified spending a minute and a half, 2 minutes on it. Some things that you should generally try and avoid are things that I see quite often that end up not actually helping your chance to win and don't constitute a ballot, are things like just saying, this is the most important issue, or nothing else matters, or this is game over, or round losing. These types of platitudes are nice, but don't actually help you win a round unless you're explaining why it is the case that these things are so devastating or important, which is the contextualization you should be doing. So you can reel back on like, oh, round completely ended because they dropped one argument, and instead explain why dropping those arguments are so disastrous for the op. The other thing is when PMRs say like, this is true, and this is true, and this argument is true, et cetera, and because of that, look to PMC, we win. The issue with this is that you're essentially asking the judge to do your job, to do your job like for you. They're saying, there are pieces of the round that can constitute a ballot. Please put them together for me and then vote for me. It will always be comparatively more strategic for you to put those pieces together for the judge instead of pointing them to where they should look. You should be doing 9/10 of the job of a judge for them in terms of writing their ballot or telling them how to vote in PMR, because that's the job of the PMR. Lastly, on impact specifically, you should be trying to outweigh your opponents, but that should not come at the cost of like truth, right? You should not be lying about the things that you're doing or massively overclaiming the extent to which your impact exists. Not only because this is often unpersuasive for a judge, but also if you massively overclaim an impact, the judge may end up just not evaluating it at all, instead of evaluating what impact you likely would have if you were more accurate in weighing that like ballot or that argument. So now that we kind of understand what all goes into creating a full ballot as opposed to just an argument in a round or a piece of weighing, you can see how over the course of a round, you may end up with 3, 4 ballots or multiple different ballots that could all be winning. However, ballots often take a lot of time to create. In the PMR, you likely will only have time for 2, maybe 3 of them if they are at the level of depth that judges will evaluate or want to pick up. So then the next question becomes, how do you prioritize ballots? Because once you've gotten to a point where you can actually understand what a ballot is and create ballots kind of regularly, you will have a secondary question of, okay, I know how to create a ballot, but is this ballot the one I should be going for? Is this the one I should be writing more responses to? Is this the one I should be writing weighing for? And this is something that overwhelmingly you will figure out just over time, like you will get a better sense for it. But there are some ways, or I guess a cheat code for figuring out which ballots are more important than others. I do want to emphasize that this is certainly for beginners who are trying to understand if they have 3 to 4 arguments, which ones to prioritize. This isn't an end all be all, and you shouldn't like pull out a calculator before PMR, but certainly this is helpful for understanding how you should be thinking about prioritization going into the PMR speech. So every ballot functionally has 2 parts to it. One, how much defense you need to read. So this is when you are re-articulating your arguments and also interacting with op responses. How much work do you need to do to actually prove to the judge that you're winning a given argument? The second part of most ballots is the weighing. So now that I have proven my arguments or proven my ballot, what is the weighing I'm going to read alongside that to actually make me win the round? And if you put these 2 things together, you will get a rough estimation of how important any given ballot is and where that ballot should go. So as a point of fact, put your best ballots first. Judges are a lot more in tuned or willing to listen to the first 30 seconds of a speech than they are to the last 30 seconds. And often, whatever you say at the top of your speech frames the way that they think about the rest of your speech. Is this like great? Maybe not. Is this how judges in the perfect world would judge? Maybe not, but this is just the reality of the league and the reality of the way that people's like subconscious work when hearing speeches. So you should be putting your stronger ballots first. Couple of things to think about here then. First, on defense, the easiest way to understand this is just something is conceded, it's 100% true, opt to not respond to it. But kind of a more realistic depiction of what you will see in round is maybe there are some responses, but they are just worse than the ones that are in PMC or MG. Or maybe there are new MO responses, but I can beat them pretty easily. Only you can judge how much an argument needs to be proven, as long as you think that it can be proven. Because some arguments have so much defense, so much op articulation, just so much time spent on them that you just need to be willing to let them go. And that's something that's often very hard, especially if it's like an argument you really like or an argument that you're very comfortable with. Don't feel as though you are forced to go for it, especially if you think you have to climb the mountain when it comes to op responses. The second part of this is weighing. So generally speaking, the more of the op that you can concede, the better it is for weighing, because it doesn't require the judge to ask themselves if you're beating the op or if your warrants are better than the op, because your ballot exists even if the op exists. So when you're thinking of weighing, you should think of things like whether or not both teams agree that something is important, or whether or not this weighing takes the op at its best or strongest or most charitable, or whether or not you can co-opt some of the things that op weighs as quite important. So for example, if op weighs like lives saved is the most important and you're winning an impact into economic devastation, something you can do in PMR is say, if the economy crashes, we lose lives because people lose jobs, they're evicted and have to live on the street, they can't afford medical care, etc. Being able to co-opt or link into ops offense when it comes to weighing can also be very strategic. And you should think of both of these things in tandem, so defense and weighing, when it comes to ballots that are like, wow, this is mostly conceded, and it also just beats the op even if everything is true. That should be the first thing I put into PMR. I should spend 2 minutes on it, make it very pretty. It probably wins me the round. Cool. Now that we kind of have a sense of both how to create a ballot and how to prioritize different ballots, one thing that you do need to remember when you get to the point of making 2, 3 ballots, interacting with the op ballots, etc., is oftentimes ballots interact with one another. So not just interact with your own case, but also interact with op's case. And sometimes debaters zero in on kind of what debates look like or what ballots look like in a vacuum. And it's always important to step back and observe how your ballots look like in the broader world of the gov and the op. This is important because sometimes your ballots actually change the way that the op functions or change the way that the gov functions in very good ways for you or very bad ways for you. Either way, taking a step back before PMR and thinking about how they interact will help you choose ballots or help you recognize when they are good or bad for you. So one of the examples I want to give for this, why it can be very strategic to think about the big picture, is the national finals for 2019. So that's the picture you're seeing on this slide. In this round, the op goes for an argument that's like, this will go super viral. And it's an argument about, it's a case about evidence ethics and the standards for submitting evidence, and whether or not regular people should be held to the same evidence standards as the police. The op makes an argument that is like, this will go super viral, everyone will see it, it will become national media attention if you change this law. The PMR begins their speech by conceding this and saying, yes, it will go viral. Regular people will be so scared of messing up evidence that they always hand it over to the police in the most professional way. So one of the op ballots that they go for ends up actually being a point of gov offense because gov recognized that that ballot interacted very favorably with the stuff that gov wanted to go for on their own case. And this can both help you pick ballots that become more important, but also cut ballots that become unstrategic in the face of the characterization of the world that op forwards. Lastly on this, sometimes this then requires you to reframe or recharacterize the world in PMR. I'd advise against doing this very often, just because oftentimes this characterization can be called new. But if you recognize that the only way for you to win, or a way for you to have your chances of winning boost up massively, is to do this recharacterization, it can be strategic and you should do it in those instances. Cool. A couple of additional notes that you should be thinking about in PMR. These are less important. These are, while strategic, less important than understanding how to create a ballot, how to prioritize them. But these are things that you should be thinking about, and especially as you get more familiar and you do the PMR more often, things that you should be incorporating into your PMR. So first on the MO, there are 2 things here. One on MOs dumping lots of new material and MOs that dump lots of new responses. So on MOs that dump lots of new material, 1, don't get scared. 2, don't feel obligated to answer everything. The worst thing you can do in the face of a very dense and response-heavy MO is to try and go line for line with the MO, because you will lose, both in the sense that the MO speech is multiple minutes longer than yours, but also because you have other things you need to do that aren't directly responsive. You should only respond to things that either A, make the ballots that you're going for impossible, like actively impede those ballots from being persuasive. So this is the thing we talked about earlier when it comes to clarifying your ballot in the face of op responses. Or if there is a new piece of material that is offensive, you can answer that as well. Secondly, though, is MO turns. So if there is a dense MO, sometimes it can be very strategic to turn pieces of the MO and create offense for you. Specifically on this, anything that MO says, PMR can get responses to that cannot be said like new. all of the responses to MO are not new. This means that if there is a piece of MO that is actually a gov argument, or that you can create a gov argument out of, it can be strategic to turn these pieces of MO and create as much gov offense as you want, because judges are often reluctant to call these things new if they come out of the MO. I would say, though, that you should not over-index towards trying to do this in every instance. Sometimes it's unstrategic. Sometimes it's just worse than the ballots you've already created. But in the face of dense MOs, you should recognize this as an option and be able to pivot accordingly in during the time of LOR if you think that it helps your chance of winning or becomes more important than other ballots that you have. So this is also a question of prioritization when you recognize how strong the MO is and compare that to what you already have for PMR ballots. The second thing is on weighing. So when you get into the PMR, a lot of new responsive material is likely new or on the verge of new unless it's responding to MO. However, all weighing that PMR does is not new and cannot be called new. So when it comes to clearing the way for your ballots or making your ballots more persuasive or just beating out the LOR ballots, you would always defer to weighing over explicit rebuttal, both because it's less likely to be called new and also because it often allows you to sidestep the individual warrant level clashes of any given argument. When you use weighing as a responsive material in this way, you can say things like, even if their argument is true, ours is more important for XYZ reason. Or even if this argument may be correct, this ballot controls the ability for this op argument to even exist in the first place. So for example, if an op makes an argument about corruption, but there's a gov ballot that says that corruption is solved better on gov side of the house, you can use that weighing to respond to the op ballot about corruption by saying, if we win this argument, it means that they don't have access to the arguments on corruption that they go for in MO or LOR. And using weighing as responsive material is often more strategic than just going for responses that half the time will be called new anyway. The next thing is the flow. So I talked about this a little bit earlier when I talked about combining different parts of arguments to make a ballot, but you should, going into PMR, not think of the PMC and MG or even the round at all as like a static and parallel like thing. You should not think of the round as a timeline from start to finish. Instead, you should think of it as like a bunch of like toys on a playground, and you as PMR should be arranging them however you see fit. So you can often move parts of PMC and MG into different places to create different ballots. Or you can move parts of LO and MO in the form of explicit concessions to also pave the way for certain ballots. Don't feel locked in or chained to the way that arguments were articulated in earlier Gov speeches, especially when a part of a good PMR's job is to recontextualize those arguments for the sake of creating a more cohesive ballot or creating a more cohesive argument for the judge to pick up. The last thing I'm going to talk about here very briefly is lying. So in the Platonic ideal of what debate should be, you should not lie. This is an intellectual activity that hopefully creates better analytical skills, and lying sidesteps a lot of that. But it's also a competitive activity, and I recognize that sometimes you want to win. We have POOs, so we have the opportunity for op to call things new, which puts the burden on op to find when things are new and call them when they are new. So in cases where you know that things are new, or know that you have to kind of sneak new things into PMR in order to have a chance of winning, and look, we've all been there. Sometimes the MG drops something, sometimes the LO is just very good. You can try and push things into the PMR that are new but won't be called. So two main strategies for doing this. One, if it is adjacent to something that is explicitly not new, sometimes people are incepted into believing that all of it was together in the MG or in the PMC and that they missed it, and they're less likely to call it. Second, if you say something that is flagrantly new, but then say something that is new but less new alongside it, sometimes the first thing will get called and not the second. And lastly, if you read it as weighing, as we talked about earlier on this slide, people are more reluctant to call weighing you, especially if you can weakly link it back to something that they may have heard earlier in the round. But again, lying is bad, saying new things is bad. Try and minimize it as much as possible. The last thing I'm going to talk about then is just practice. So the thing with PMRs versus PMCs or LOs or case writing is that oftentimes it takes a lot longer to develop the skill, and the practice itself takes longer because the PMR is the last speech in a round. Also, sometimes it's just hard to get 4 people together to do an APDA round. Everyone has schedules, they have things going on. I will say one thing that can be very helpful is giving PMRs to recorded rounds. So lots of recorded rounds on the forum and on APDA videos. You can listen to PMC, flow the op, flow the MG, and then give a PMR or a PMR that you think is winning, and then listen to the PMR that was actually given in the round to hear the differences between what they chose strategically and what you chose strategically, maybe the differences in rhetoric and how they constructed the ballots, any differences that you find as salient, and you can consider whether or not you made the correct decision or give redos of the PMR. Another thing is, for tournaments you go to, you can give PMRs to the rounds that occurred like in practice. So if you have Gov round 1 and you were very close to winning and the judge says, oh, well, if there was only a little bit more weighing on this ballot, you can give a speech redo of that PMR cognizant of what you missed or where you were incapable to get the ballot, and try and attempt to do it again in a way that is more persuasive. Either way, you should be trying to identify where you are struggling. So is it struggling in argument construction? Is it struggling in weighing? Is it struggling in contextualization? And try and zero in on those things when practicing. So you should practice, for example, putting more mechanisms or warrants into the ballot that you create, or giving an additional explicit weighing mechanism for the ballot that you create, or just making it sound nicer than like, go to warrant 3 subpoint 4, extend this, here are the implications. Because even after you get to the point where you can win these Gov rounds, it's still good to speak well in these rounds for the rest of your tournament. And that is it. So if there are any questions, I'll take them now.